He's frequently accused of being eclectic. I'm not sure exactly what this means, except from a perspective that presumes that systematic theory, and systems theory perhaps, is the only kind of theoretical activity that's appropriate for us. I like to think of his work actually rather as something more like a sponge. Most interesting things that I read at some point come up in Bauman's work. So his approach is additive, it's situational, it's incidental, and it becomes more like this as it proceeds. The little books that he writes after he retires, which are not written for his colleagues, not written for us, but for punters, encounter a decline in the number of footnotes, references to Big Brother, quotations from scandalously unscholarly sources like The Guardian Weekly, an attempt to engage with a life world which he presumes that his punters might actually share, and I think they do. It's a plural attitude to social theory. Social theory here works as something like Babel. It might be viewed as a sociological impressionism, category that's been used by people like David Frisby to describe Zimmel's work. The sense is that particular theories are stories. There's no need for us to accept just one. So, recognising that the language of open and closed is loaded, it seems to me nevertheless to be an interesting possibility that this might be something like an open theory, because it points outside itself to problems in the world and everyday life in modern times, to other ideas, to other arguments, to other issues. It's not a self-referential theory. Consequently, it's not, and this is a horrible word, but unavoidable, it's not easily operationalisable. It's not easily put to work in a kind of strategic way in order to please the ARC or anybody else in particular. It's not operationalisable in any routine way. So there's no Bauman school. There's no school of people following Bauman. He did not set out to establish a school. My suggestion is that you can only follow Bauman by going your own way. I'm going to close by reading a bit from a more scholarly than personal piece that I wrote for Performance, which is called Another Bauman, The Anthropological Imagination. Zygmunt Bauman is widely known as the postmodern sociologist, now as the theorist of liquid modernity. My sense is that he really is neither. Bauman's project is mobile, as befits its object. Modernity moves. The earlier enthusiasm for the postmodern, from legislators and interpreters, 1987, was in part a reaction to the sense of sea change. After communism, modernity was bound to mean something different. But the postmodern was also a cultural phenomenon with a use-by date, except in the most general sense, that of being after modernism. The idea of the liquid modern, in turn, refers both to the sense of heightened mobility associated with revived uncertainty, all the solid melts into air, and to the closer post-war sense that the robust institutions associated with Fordism and Keynesianism, the welfare state, now dissolve before our eyes. Whatever happened to full employment and the social regime which constructed it? There is your answer. What is the liquid modern? It is an emblem or a symbol rather than a theory or a social phase of development. It represents a way of seeing where what was taken for granted after World War II now seems mercurial, perhaps especially to those of us who have lived through this. For those born into this present, our children, this acute anxiety and insecurity must surely seem normalised, simply the way the world works. For those born into the 80s and after, this world must seem speedy, buzzy, bubbly and demanding, but essentially modern, representing the now, the Jetztzeit, rather than the new revolution. It must feel like the revolution of the modern itself. The image of liquidity in social theory has, however, become a new scholarly common sense. Liquidity has become a futurist version of the zombie metaphor, where often all it's indicated is the sense of process and movement, which sociologists have always sought to grasp, though it's always mercurial. This is not, then, an indication that all that's solid melts into air. Bauman's intention is not to turn the idea of liquid modernity into a hard phase of development that separates it from what came before. All that's solid melts into air is not the new mantra. It is the significant period mistranslation of Marx's image, which referred rather to the standing and estate-like character of the earlier pre-locomotive period. Perhaps then Bauman is, as he's given to insist, after all a sociologist, an analyst or a critic of modernity. Of course, yet there's so much more in his work. A surplus of meanings, arguments, ideas, thinkers. Evidently, Bauman's work is more than a sociology, though it could also be seen as a sociology in general, everything that is social, rather than as part of the specific post-war disciplinary sense of sociology. Bauman is, among other things, I think actually a 19th century figure, a 19th century personality, a sage, a professor of things in general. He's also a continental sociologist, which means that he draws no hard lines between sociology and philosophy. The affinity here is with other East Central European writers. And because his background is continental, he also presumes that insight appears often in literature. His earlier explicit enthusiasm for hermeneutics, in the book called Hermeneutics and Social Sciences, 1978, tells us of his commitment to both those fields of understanding. To introduce hermeneutics into social sciences is to add to it respect and curiosity for the book of life. One book then leads to another. Biblical hermeneutics opens up into the art of reading texts in general, including literary as well as sociological texts. The broader issue is that truth, insight or wisdom can be found variously in all sorts of places. As Keith Tester then observes, Bauman can find as much power in a line from Kundera, Borges or Musil as in the imagery of Gramsci, Simmel or Marx. This should come as no surprise to us, for it's consonant with the continental approach itself. Shakespeare and Goethe might have been its early modern pioneers. Beyond the question of disciplinary history, Bauman's attraction to hermeneutics represents an attitude rather than an orthodoxy or method. Bauman is deeply committed to the conversational model in social sciences. Hermeneutics is central because interpretation is fundamental, and it is processual, circular, characterised by movement rather than axioms or truth claims. Human beings tell stories and they seek out stories. This is why ethnography matters, as mythology, as storytelling. The stories that show in Bauman's work are many and various. This sense of diversity of insight sometimes generates the charge of eclecticism. When it comes to stories about others, however, many of Bauman's interlocutors are anthropologists. Along with the anthropologists, there are other precedents, storytellers of other kinds: Rabelais, Herodotus, Montesquieu in the Persian letters, and of course Montaigne, the greatest exemplar of the essay, The Attempt at Understanding. In a completely different register, and connecting across the kinds of fields conventionally thought of as literary and anthropological, there are echoes of Bauman in the work of Georges Bataille on sacrifice and excess. On occasion, Bauman employs anthropologists to develop particular insights. In Legislators and Interpreters, for example, Paul Rodin is used to work the problem of primitivism, or the modernity of the primitive. Rodin writes, for example, that primitive man is afraid of only one thing, the uncertainties of everyday life. Perhaps uncertainty is an anthropological universal across primitive, modern and liquid modern times. In Bauman's case, the connection is to Freud across the essays that make up the book called Postmodernity and Its Discontents, where the desire for freedom gives way to the desire for security after World War II, and then again to the increased popular desire for freedom, even at the expense of increased security for some more than others. More again for Bauman, intellectuals work as mythologists in this broad scenario, for it is they who develop and propagate myths of foundation as the inventors of modern tradition. Ernest Gellner is also set to work in Bauman's garden in Legislators and Interpreters. This image has travelled further in the idea that wild culture, or the culture of gamekeepers, is brought to curb by gardeners and gardening culture, the culture of control. Elsewhere, later, Girard comes to work alongside or nearby Agamben. Modern cultures still have their sacrifices or scapegoats. Sacrifice is always the sacrifice of others. Two anthropologists relied upon more substantially in Bauman's work. These are Mary Douglas and Claude Lévi-Strauss. Mary Douglas's classic Purity and Danger becomes central to Modernity and the Holocaust and its sequel, Modernity and Ambivalence. In Bauman's work, as I implied earlier, this logic points to a larger project which you might call the sociology of violence. The central clue for Bauman in Purity and Danger is obvious. Dirt is essentially disorder. Dirt is therefore relative to time and place. Uncleanliness is matter out of place. It is but a short step for people out of place to become dirt, the object of social hygiene. Slime is liquid dirt. And this is the theme Bauman uses to connect anti-Semitism to its exterminatory version via the work of Sartre. The conceptual Jew was visqueuse in Sartrean terms, slimy in those of Mary Douglas. Viewed as dirt or as weed, the conceptual Jew was a threat to the Nazi conception of order. So did masses of Jews become its victims. Matter out of place, people out of place, all this would have to be sorted, put into order, first by plans of expulsion, Madagascar, then by death camps and roving battalions. Bauman pursues this idea from Modernity and Holocaust through to its annex, the book called Modernity and Ambivalence. Here it's the larger concept of the stranger, which or who works as the visqueuse or slimy, both indicating the ineradicable ambivalence of the category and the position. Plainly, Bauman's use of Douglas is selective. This is the way he thinks, associates and operates. Similarly with Lévi-Strauss. The pertinence of Lévi-Strauss for Bauman's project shows especially in two ways. The first is in Bauman's sociology of culture, where structuring works not as result, but as activity. Contrary to the logic of Lévi-Strauss, Bauman reads structures as process, as endless beginning, rather than as categorical logic. The second use of Lévi-Strauss for Bauman is in the sociology of the other. The text which fascinates here is not the elementary structures of kinship, but the wonderfully wistful memoirs of Tristes Tropiques. The particular image which detains Bauman is in Lévi-Strauss's distinction between anthropoemic and anthropophagic strategies. Bauman anticipates the theme in a footnote to Modernity and the Holocaust, where it's Lévi-Strauss's interviews with Charbonnier which act as the prompt. Bauman discusses liquidity in the context of the Nazi gas vans. Fluids of the humankind would flow more or less easily from vans, depending on their thickness. People about to be murdered lose control of their bodies. For the technologists, these were technical problems of thick and thin fluids, not desperate problems, desperate human problems of excreta and vomit. In Levi-Strauss's discussion with Charbonnier, Bauman recollects, the indication is that our modern civilization is anthropoemic, as opposed to anthropophagic, traditional cultures. They devoured their adversaries while we vomit them up, separate, segregate, evict, exclude from our universe of obligation. Bauman returns to Levi-Strauss in an essay called The Making and Unmaking of Strangers. Now the frame of reference is firmly modern. Modern strangers, for Bauman, are the waste of the state's ordering zeal. Order building is a war of attrition waged against strangers and the strange. In this war, to borrow Levi-Strauss's concepts, the alternative but now complementary strategies are intermittently deployed. Bauman's claim is that in our times, political regimes combine these two strategies of devouring and expelling our others. Modernity is always traditional, it's always mixed. Modern states then combine the politics and administration of assimilation and expulsion. In Bauman's work, this points to a larger project towards a sociology of surplus populations. The field of possible sociology of surplus populations is animated by the idea of waste, including human waste and wasted humans. So finally then, Bauman develops this theme in Wasted Lives, a book he publishes in 2004. Behind this image of waste, of excessive and rapacious consumption, of the waste of humans, as well as piles of trash and discards that ascend towards heaven, is what I would call a critique of modernity as potlatch culture. This is, of course, a preeminently anthropological idea. It's locus classicus as in mos, the gift. Their potlatch is distant rather than present. It combines images of gifting and destruction, which is sacrificial. Potlatch refers both to the senses to nourish and to consume. It involves killing wealth, and it arouses violence, rivalry, and antagonism. Potlatch demonstrates the future of the strong by expending it to the humiliation of the others. Humans celebrate waste transhistorically when they are blessed by excess abundance and to show their temporal status and power. The result divides the planet into those who contribute to the garbage heaps and those who work them. Even those who work them in a perverse way are surrounded by abundance, by the detritus of plastic, steel, obsolete technologies stacked in waste piles of B-52s, car hulks and computer frames, dead computer screens and hard drives. It's estimated that in 2004 there are 315 million dead computers in the United States. Bauman wants us to confront the fact that we're awash in shit. Where our own refuse, human and material, tells us as much of our civilization as the wonders of electronic communication and BMWs, high fashion on high streets. If our lives are indeed mercurial, liquid modern, then we are also surrounded by shit. Dirt is famously, per Mary Douglas, matter out of place, but you do not drown in it. This new culture of liquid modernity is something else. There are, finally, two other senses in which Bauman's project works anthropological. The first has to do with Bauman's fascination with the other, understood as the realm of radical possibility or imagination. Bauman's fascination with the other also manifests as utopia. This means that the other is not only understood negatively as stigma within a sociological critique of power, but also positively as elsewhere in possibility, elsewhere in time and place. The other is routinely reduced in contemporary sociology to the victim, the enemy, the outsider, the stranger, the alter ego. The idea of alterity as utopia, in contrast, is open to value and not only to stigma. The connection of utopia to literature, fiction and satire returns us again to Tester's enthusiasm for the idea of Bauman's project as literary and not only, in the narrow sense, sociological. The second sense in which Bauman's thought is consistently anthropological is to do with his insistence on the exoticization of the ordinary. The best example of this can be found in his remarkable textbook, Thinking Sociologically, 1990, whose principal purpose is to present and advocate the project of sociology as the defamiliarisation of the familiar. Thinking sociologically, that particular book is also almost about thinking modernity anthropologically. It's clear from its table of contents: freedom and dependence, us and them, strangers, gift and exchange, self-preservation, moral duty, nature and culture, order and chaos, and so on. Going about the business of life, knowing how to go on, to deal with anthropological universals of life and death, as well as modern contingencies, mobile phones and reality television. We could always do other. This message of Bauman's, I think, persists. Elsewhere, Bauman describes what he calls the sweet smell of decomposition. Here he connects back to a radically underdeveloped sensibility in social criticism, to the significance of the senses and the sense of smell in particular. George Orwell used smell as an indicator. The smell of decomposition we might, in contrast, connect with warmer climes than Wigan Pier or Leeds, perhaps Barcelona or Bangkok. The logic of the curiosity remains powerful, and its interests remain suggestive of what might be a kind of urban ethnography. Whatever the case, as I hope to have shown in this little reading, this second reading, Bauman's work is also suggestive of an anthropological imagination. Whatever the status of sociology or literature here, Bauman also behaves like an anthropologist of modernity. In this, the nature of his curiosity coincides with what Joel Kahn calls for as an anthropology of modernity. The conversation with the other is also a conversation among ourselves. So these are some of the things that I've learned from Zygmunt Bauman. Thank you for listening to me.